Those were the words that ended my childhood. No warning, no second chances, just my father standing in the doorway, his face stone cold as he tossed me out like I was nothing. I barely had time to process what was happening. 1 minute, I was living under his roof, trying to survive in a house where I was barely tolerated. The next, I was on the porch with a suitcase in my hand, staring at the closed door in disbelief. Behind the door stood my stepmother, Victoria, the woman who had spent years making sure I never truly belonged. And my stepsister, Emily, the golden child who could do no wrong. I knew Victoria had always hated me. I just never thought my father would actually choose her over his own son. But he did. And that was the day I realized I was alone in the world. Homeless and hopeless. The first few weeks were hell. I had nowhere to go. I crashed on a friend's couch for a while, but his parents weren't exactly thrilled about having an extra mouth to feed. Eventually, I found myself sleeping in the back of an abandoned car near the edge of town. I was cold, hungry, alone. And I hated them. I hated my father for being so weak. I hated Victoria for being so manipulative. I hated Emily for never even pretending to care. But most of all, I hated myself. For not seeing it sooner. For not fighting harder. For still, even now, wishing my father would change his mind and come find me. But he never did. And after a while, I stopped waiting. I scraped by, doing whatever work I could find, washing dishes, sweeping floors, unloading trucks at a warehouse. I barely made enough to eat, but I survived. And as time passed, the pain turned into something else. Determination. I swore I would make something of myself. I swore I would build a life so good that they would choke on their own regrets. And that's exactly what I did. The rise. Fast forward 10 years. I wasn't the same kid who left that house with nothing. I had built my own company from the ground up, a logistics firm that started with just me in an old van, making deliveries for small businesses. I worked until my hands were raw, until my body ached from exhaustion. And slowly, it paid off. My business grew. 1 van became 5, then 10. I learned everything I could about the industry, took risks when others hesitated, and made deals no one else would touch. By the time I hit 26, I had over 100 employees, a fleet of trucks, and a multi-million-dollar operation. I had done it. I had proven them wrong. And I thought I had finally put the past behind me. Until the day they showed up. A family reunion, or a setup? I was in my office when my assistant buzzed in. "Sir, there's a couple here to see you. They say they're family." I frowned. Family? I hadn't spoken to them in 10 years. Not a single word. Not after I found out my father sold our house and moved to a bigger place with Victoria and Emily. Not after I learned he told people I had run away because I was a troubled kid. Yet here they were. I could have told my assistant to send them away. I could have ignored them, let them sit in that lobby for hours. But I didn't. I told her to send them in. And when my father and Victoria walked through the door, fake smiles plastered on their aging faces, I leaned back in my chair, crossed my arms, and gave them a look I had waited 10 years to give. A look that said, "I know why you're here. And I can't wait to hear you beg." I let them stand there in silence for a moment, watching them squirm under the weight of my gaze. My father looked older, his hair grayer, his shoulders slouched in a way I didn't remember. Victoria, on the other hand, hadn't changed much. Still polished, still cold, still acting like she belonged in every room she walked into. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I asked, my voice calm, detached. My father cleared his throat. "Son, I raised a hand. "No. You don't get to call me that." He flinched, but Victoria stepped forward, wearing a forced smile. Now. There's no need for hostility. We just wanted to see how you were doing. It's been so long." I almost laughed. So long? 10 years of radio silence, and they just happened to show up now? I'm doing great, I said, my tone flat. But you already knew that, didn't you? Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Victoria's fake smile faltered. That's not fair. No, I cut her off. What wasn't fair was being tossed out like garbage when I was 16. What wasn't fair was spending nights hungry and homeless because my own father couldn't stand up to you. That wasn't fair. My father shifted uncomfortably. We made mistakes, he admitted, his voice lower now. But we were just trying to do what was best for the family. I narrowed my eyes. Best for the family? Or best for Victoria and Emily? A tense silence filled the room. My father wouldn't meet my gaze. He didn't have to. We both knew the answer. Victoria sighed dramatically. Look, we didn't come here to argue about the past. What's done is done. Then why did you come? I asked, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. Victoria shot my father a look, and he hesitated before finally speaking. It's about Emily. I raised an eyebrow. Emily? She's struggling, my father said, sighing like this was some great burden on his soul. She tried starting her own business, but things haven't been going well. She's drowning in debt, and, well, we were hoping you could help her. For a second, I just stared at him. Then, slowly, the realization sank in. I let out a bitter laugh. Let me get this straight, I said. You threw me out when I was 16. Left me to rot. And now that your precious daughter is failing, you suddenly remember I exist? Victoria pursed her lips. You've done well for yourself. Exceptionally well. We thought, given your success, you might want to share some of that with family. I nearly choked on the sheer audacity of it. Family? I repeated, laughing again. You're joking, right? We raised you, my father snapped, his tone sharp now. We fed you, clothed you. You abandoned me. I exploded, slamming my fist on the desk. You didn't raise me. You tolerated me until Victoria decided she didn't want me around anymore. He opened his mouth to argue, but I wasn't done. Where were you when I was sleeping in the back of a car? Where were you when I was skipping meals because I couldn't afford food? Where were you when I needed a father? My voice shook with rage, years of buried pain finally clawing its way to the surface. You didn't give a damn about me back then. And now, you want me to hand over my business to Emily? Are you insane? Victoria bristled. We're not asking you to hand it over. Just to help her. Maybe let her take a leadership role. I scoffed. Emily has no business experience. She can learn, my father insisted. You can mentor her. I cut him off with a cold stare. Like you mentored me? Silence. Victoria sighed, shaking her head like I was the one being difficult. Listen, she said, her voice softer now, almost coaxing. This could be a fresh start for all of us. A way to repair old wounds. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Let me make something very clear, I said, my voice deadly calm. I don't owe you anything. Not money. Not business opportunities. Nothing. My father's jaw tightened. We're your family. No, you're not, I said without hesitation. Family doesn't throw you away when things get inconvenient. Family doesn't come crawling back only when they need something. Victoria's expression darkened. So that's it, then? You're just going to abandon us? I let out a sharp breath, shaking my head in disbelief. The nerve of you, I muttered. You abandoned me first. She rolled her eyes. So dramatic. I stood up, done with this conversation. Get out. My father's eyes widened. Wait. Get out. I snapped, my voice echoing through the office. Victoria grabbed his arm. Come on, Richard. We're wasting our time. But as they turned to leave, my father hesitated. He looked back at me, his expression unreadable. "One day, you're going to regret this." I met his gaze with pure ice. "I regret ever wanting you to love me." He flinched like I had physically hit him. And then they were gone. I sat back down, my hands clenched into fists. My heart was racing, my blood boiling. They really thought they could just waltz back into my life and take what I had built. Like I owed them something. Like I hadn't earned every single piece of my success. I took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. They wanted something from me? Fine. I'd give them something. But it wouldn't be what they expected. I didn't sleep that night. After my so-called family walked out of my office, I sat there for hours, replaying every word of our conversation. The audacity. The sheer entitlement of it all. After everything they had done to me, after throwing me out like trash, they still thought they could use me. Victoria had walked into my office acting like she still had control over me. My father had barely put up a fight. And Emily? She didn't even bother showing up herself. No, she let her parents do the dirty work, just like always. They thought they could manipulate me. They thought I was still that desperate kid, starving for their approval. They thought wrong. Step 1, digging up the truth. If they wanted me involved in their lives again, fine. I'd be involved. I called my private investigator first thing in the morning. "I need everything you can find on Emily and her failing business," I told him. "Financials, debts, investors, everything." I already knew Emily had run her company into the ground, but I wanted details. And what I found? It was worse than I imagined. Emily's so-called business was a luxury boutique she had opened 2 years ago. But instead of actually running it, she used it as her personal shopping fund, blowing through investor money like it was her allowance. Bags, jewelry, first-class vacations, she had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on herself while her business rotted. And when the money dried up, she took out loans. Massive loans, using my father's house as collateral. Which meant one thing. If she failed, my father and Victoria would lose everything. I leaned back in my chair, smiling to myself. Oh, this was going to be fun. Step 2, the trap. A week later, I reached out to my father. I kept it simple. A text. "Let's talk. Meet me at my office tomorrow at noon." I knew they'd come running. And sure enough, the next day, they walked through my door, looking smug like they had already won. "I knew you'd come around," Victoria said, her voice dripping with fake warmth. I gestured for them to sit. "I thought about what you said," I told them. "About family. About second chances. And you're right. Maybe it's time we move forward." My father let out a breath of relief. "I'm glad to hear that, son." "I just have one condition," I said, folding my hands on the desk. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" I smiled. "Full control of Emily's business." Silence. My father blinked. "What?" "If I'm going to help, I need complete control," I said. "Emily steps down. I take over." Victoria's mouth tightened. "That's not what we agreed to." "I didn't agree to anything," I corrected. "You came to me for help, remember?" My father hesitated. "Emily, she worked hard to build that company." I let out a short laugh. "No, she didn't. She spent investor money on handbags and spa trips. She took out loans she couldn't afford. And now, she's weeks away from bankruptcy." I leaned forward. "You didn't come to me because you wanted to rebuild our relationship. You came because you're afraid of losing your house." My father paled. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You did your research." "Of course I did," I said smoothly. "And now I'm offering you a way out." I leaned back, watching them squirm. Emily walks away from the business publicly. No one ever finds out how badly she screwed up. You two keep your house. And I clean up the mess she made. My father looked conflicted, but Victoria wasn't having it. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "Emily built that company." "No, she ruined that company," I shot back. "And right now, I'm your best chance at saving it." She clenched her jaw. "And if we refuse?" I smiled coldly. "Then Emily's business collapses, her debt collectors come knocking, and you lose your house." I tilted my head. "Your call." My father looked at Victoria, waiting for her to say something. And for the first time since I had met her, she had nothing to say. Step 3: The kill shot. The next day, Emily made an announcement on social media. "After much thought, I have decided to step down as CEO of my company. I'm excited for this next chapter and grateful for the opportunities ahead." No mention of debt. No mention of failure. Just a clear. But behind. Once I had control, I did exactly what I planned. I sold off every piece of that. The store? And Emily? She was left with nothing. She didn't. The aftermath. She stormed into my office, furious. "You lied to me." I barely looked up from my paperwork. "No, I saved you from public humiliation," I corrected. "If I had let things go the way they were, you would have been bankrupt and a joke." "You." I chuck. Her face. I stood up, towering over her. "Dad? The same man who threw me out when I was 16? The same man who begged me for help because you were two again for." Her mouth. Because she had lost. She turned on. I sat back down. For 10 years. And they were the ones left with nothing. The moment Emily stormed out of my office, I knew the war wasn't over. She was humiliated. Furious. And knowing my stepmother, Victoria, she wasn't going to let this go. I expected retaliation. A desperate last-ditch effort to claw back something from the empire I had built. And I was right. 2 days later, my assistant buzzed in. "Sir, we have a problem." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "What now?" She hesitated. "It's your father. He's suing you." I blinked. Then, I laughed. "The lawsuit." Victoria and Emily must have spent all night scheming, because by morning, my father had filed a lawsuit claiming that I had coerced them into giving up Emily's company. They wanted millions in damages. And the best part? They actually thought they had a chance. I met with my lawyer, who barely contained his amusement. "This is one of the sloppiest lawsuits I've ever seen," he said, flipping through the documents. "They're arguing that you manipulated them into handing over control, but all the paperwork is clean. Emily signed everything willingly." "Of course she did," I said dryly. "Because she thought she was getting a cushy executive job out of it." My lawyer smirked. "This won't even make it to trial. We'll bury them." "Good," I said. "Make sure they feel it. Destroying their reputation." I could have left it at that. I could have let the lawsuit die in court, let them crawl away licking their wounds. But they had made a mistake. They had come for me publicly. And I wasn't going to let them walk away without consequences. So I made a few calls. By the next morning, every major business outlet was running the story. CEO betrayed by estranged family, a shocking attempt to steal his company. I made sure the world knew exactly what kind of people they were. The news spread fast: interviews, articles, social media. The public ate it up. People dug into Emily's past, uncovering the ridiculous ways she had burned through investor money. They dragged Victoria for her manipulative tactics. My father, once respected in his own social circles, was suddenly a pariah. Even his longtime friends cut ties with him. And Emily? She became a joke. Her name trended for days: memes, posts mocking her downfall. No one in the business world would touch her after that. She tried defending herself, of course. She went on some talk show, crying about how she was betrayed by her cruel and greedy brother. It backfired spectacularly. Viewers roasted her. Comments sections obliterated her. She had spent years living off her family's favoritism. Now, for the first time in her life, she was experiencing what it felt like to be powerless. The collapse. Victoria and my father dropped the lawsuit within a week. They had no choice, their names were in the mud, and their lawyer probably told them they were going to get crushed. But it didn't matter. Because by then, their lives had already started to fall apart. My father, the man who had thrown me out like trash, lost everything. Without my help, the financial strain from Emily's failures finally caught up to them. The banks repossessed the house. The same house they had chosen over me. And Victoria? She walked out. The moment she realized there was no money left, no security, no power, she abandoned my father just like they had abandoned me. Poetic justice. As for Emily? She tried to bounce back, but no one trusted her. No one would invest in her. No one wanted to associate with her name. The last I heard, she was working some low-level job at a boutique in another city, far from the glamorous life she once flaunted. Running into my father. Months later, I was leaving a restaurant when I spotted him. Sitting alone on a park bench, staring at nothing. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in just a few months. For a second, I considered walking past him. Pretending I didn't see him. But something in me, not forgiveness, but closure, made me stop. I stepped up beside him. Looks like things didn't work out for you. He turned his head slowly, eyes widening as he saw me. For the first time, there was no anger, no entitlement. Just a man who had lost everything. Son, he rasped. I shook my head. You don't get to call me that. He swallowed, looking down at his hands. I made mistakes. I scoffed. That's one way to put it. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he let out a shuddering breath. I lost everything, he admitted. Victoria. The house. My reputation. Emily barely speaks to me anymore. I studied him, my face unreadable. And? His lip trembled. And I'm sorry. I almost laughed. Not out of humor, but out of sheer disbelief. You're sorry? I repeated. For what, exactly? For kicking me out? For siding with Victoria? Or for the fact that it all blew up in your face? He closed his eyes. I should have been a better father. For a brief second, I saw a glimpse of regret in his face. Maybe even shame. But it wasn't enough. Not even close. I took a deep breath. You don't get to apologize now. Not after a decade of silence. Not after everything you did. I know, he whispered. I don't know how to fix this. I stared at him for a long moment. And then, finally, I said. You don't. His face crumpled. I turned to leave, but paused just before walking away. I spent years wishing you'd come back for me, I said quietly. But you never did. And now? I don't need you anymore. With that, I walked away, leaving him behind just like he had left me all those years ago. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. It had been weeks since I last saw my father on that bench, and I thought that was the end of it. I had nothing left to say to him. Nothing left to prove. But life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. The unexpected call. I was sitting in my office, reviewing a new expansion deal for my company, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. But something in my gut told me to answer. Hello? A weak, tired voice came through the line. My father. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temple. Then why are you calling? A long pause. Then. I'm in the hospital. I stiffened. He coughed, his breath shaky. Lung infection. Doctor says it's bad. I don't really have anyone else to call. His voice cracked on that last part. And for the first time in years, I heard something I had never expected from him. Defeat. This was a man who had spent his whole life believing he was above consequences. That his choices would never come back to haunt him. And now, he had nothing. No house. No money. No wife. And now, possibly not much time left. A choice to make. I sat in silence, gripping the phone tighter. I could have hung up. It would have been easy. Just one tap, and I'd never have to think about him again. But I didn't. Because despite everything, despite the betrayal, the cruelty, the years of pain, he was still my father. And for some reason, I needed to see him one last time. The hospital room. When I arrived, he looked small. He used to be this towering, intimidating presence. But now? His skin was pale, his hair thinner than I remembered. The tubes and wires attached to him made him seem fragile, human. His eyes widened when he saw me. You came. I pulled up a chair, keeping my expression neutral. You called. He let out a dry chuckle. Guess I did. For a while, we just sat there, the beeping of the machines filling the silence. Then, finally, he sighed. I screwed up, didn't I? I stared at him, my hands clasped together. Yeah. You did. He nodded slowly, as if finally accepting it. I thought I was doing what was best. Thought I was making the right choices for the family. His lips curled into a bitter smile. Turns out, I was just making the right choices for Victoria. Hearing him say it out loud was strange. For years, I had waited for him to acknowledge it, to admit that he had chosen to abandon me. But now that he was, I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected. Just exhaustion. You hurt me, I said, my voice steady. More than you'll ever understand. He swallowed hard. I know. I exhaled slowly. And I don't forgive you. He flinched, but nodded. I wouldn't expect you to. Another long pause. Then, his voice dropped to a whisper. But I'm proud of you. I froze. He let out a weak chuckle. Not that it matters much now, huh? But I am. You built something incredible. Something I never thought you could do. He turned his head toward me, his eyes glassy. And you did it without me. I clenched my jaw, my chest tight. Too little, too late. But still. Some small, broken part of me, the 16-year-old kid who had stood in the rain, begging not to be thrown out, needed to hear that. Even if it didn't change anything. The final goodbye. I stayed for a little while longer, listening as he rambled about his regrets. About how he wished he had been stronger, smarter, better. I didn't comfort him. I didn't pretend everything was okay. Because it wasn't. When I finally stood to leave, he looked up at me, his eyes desperate. This is the last time I'll see you, isn't it? He asked. I nodded. Yeah. A single tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't try to stop it. I deserve that, he whispered. I lingered for just a second longer. Then I turned, walking out of the hospital room, leaving him behind for the last time. And as I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp evening air, I felt lighter than I had in years.